and been taking some notes and putting down some stuff. I wanted to end our time together with a Q&A session, and this is only going to go well if you participate, okay? He's going to answer questions if you ask them. I don't think really anything's off limits. He's willing to tackle any issue, subject, whether it's church-related or Scripture-related, whether it's the situation that he has gone through himself. He will be more than happy to address some of the issues related to that. And that's what this is for. This is for us to be able to stretch some of the things that have been discussed out a little further. And how do they apply to our lives? How do we walk in this? Because I already have questions that I can ask, so I know that some of you do. And this is what I've learned over the years. I can almost guarantee you, whatever question you have, several other people have that same question or something similar to that question. And they might be a little too nervous to ask it, okay? But if you will ask it, then it'll help get the conversation moving, okay? Now, I have a mic, and I'm going to go to you when you ask your question. And here's the reason why. We're recording this just for in case you would like to have a copy of all the sessions. We're going to have them available. But it's not going to help if you're listening to this and the only thing you hear is the answer. So we want the question to be recorded as well so we know what we're talking about. We will not give your name, okay, or anything like that. So you won't have your name on there unless a few of you might want it on there just because you enjoy the attention. But we won't do that, okay? So Tullian, I got you a stool. If you want to sit down, you may not want to. You may just want to stand, but that's completely up to you.
I might do both.
But we just want to open the floor with questions, and I'll get out of the way, and I'll just carry the mic to you and let you ask it aloud, okay? So anybody?
And let me reiterate,
Yeah, go ahead.
There is nothing off limits. If you ask a super personal question, I might tell you it's none of your freaking business, but I will acknowledge the question was asked. Yeah.
Tully, I understand that. I know that you're the grandson of Billy and nephew of Franklin.
Yeah.
Were they a great influence in your decision making to come into the ministry?
Yes and no. I'm one of 19 grandchildren. My mom is the oldest of their 5 children, and she had 7 of us. So 7 of those 19 grandchildren are, my family. My granddad and my grandmother in particular, they both had a profound impact on me growing up in a variety of different ways and for different reasons. I didn't really know what a big deal my granddad was until I was a little older, because you're born into this and you grew up in it and you don't know any different. And yet as I got older, I began to realize how influential he was, and to me he was just Daddy Bill. That's what we called him. And we would see him all the time, spend summers in North Carolina, in western North Carolina, and they would come down and see us every Thanksgiving for a couple weeks, and so we would see them at various times during the year. So we were all very close, and I think his impact on me had more to do with who he was than what he did. So the call that I sense from God to preach the gospel came so specifically and strongly from God. It was not, in that sense, influenced by my grandparents, or I didn't feel like it was my destiny to go into the family business. Not at all. But once I was in it and preparing for it in college and seminary, he was a huge help to me. I would have the best conversations with him. Anytime I had any question about ministry, preaching, to have him at my disposal was, of course, a remarkable gift, an amazing gift. Because he not only lived through the 20th century and the beginning part of the 21st century, but in many ways helped shape the sort of the public version of Christianity in the 20th century. Having conversations with him about just people he met, things that he did. I mean, when some of the stories, because I mean, I'm somewhat of a history buff, and so being able to have a one-on-one conversation with someone who not only lived it but helped shape it was remarkable to me. Like, that was so fascinating. I mean, as many conversations as we may have had about God, the best conversations I can remember having with him were about just historical things that he witnessed, saw, helped shape, or was a part of. I remember talking to him about his meeting with Winston Churchill, his meeting with various presidents, what it was like to meet C.S. Lewis. I mean, just things that, as a college student and a seminarian, I was just fascinated by. So he was just always an ever-present influence in my life. But in terms of, did he have a direct impact on my sense of call to ministry? Not particularly. I mean, my grandparents were great about encouraging their grandkids to do whatever God called them to do, but never felt any pressure at all. They were going to be remarkably supportive no matter what we decided to do. But once God's call on my life came, he was an indispensable resource to me.
Great. All right, someone else?
Thank you. On a personal note, I'd like to thank you for your honesty in your words.
You're welcome.
I can imagine that's not so simple to do that. Pretty
Or
difficult
fun.
to do that, so we appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You said that our horizontal consequences is not a reflection of God's vertical condemnation. But aren't we due some responsibility for our sins
Oh, yeah.
and our reputation and so forth? I'd like for you to expound on that if you could.
Yeah. So what I meant when I said that was the horizontal consequences we experience as a result of our sin do not reflect God's condemnation of us. So while they may be the consequences are the fruit of foolish decisions made or selfish decisions made, those foolish decisions that we make and those selfish decisions that we make that we suffer the consequences for, and that other people around us may also suffer the consequences for, are not a reflection of God's condemnation of us. Because of Jesus, there is therefore now no condemnation before God. We are in forever and loved eternally because of what Jesus has done for us. That does not mean that if I run a red light doing 120 miles an hour, I'm not going to get pulled over. So, it's kind of the same thing that if I show up late to work every day and I, don't do a good job, or I embezzle money, or whatever the case may be, okay? If I'm a Christian, and let's say I'm guilty of those things, of just being a poor employee, I may not lose God's love, because God's love for me is not based on whether I'm a good or bad employee, but I may lose my job. So that's kind of what I mean. I mean, are we responsible for the choices that we make? Absolutely. Do we suffer the consequences, both good and bad, for the choices that we make? Absolutely. That goes without saying. Does God's love for us depend on what we do or don't do? And the answer to that is no. It's dependent entirely on what Jesus has done for us. Does that help? Okay. You're
All
welcome.
right, someone else?
Yeah, I do got a question. I want to ask about the question about this thing here in the book. I just want to ask you a question about this thing here in the book. I know it said you've been on TV news on like 60 Minutes or other TV shows like the 700 Club or other radio station.
Yeah.
Did you get called in for that, or you kind of scheduled yourself to go in and say, hey, I like to?
No. They call me for that stuff. Yeah.
They call
No.
you. They
I
call
don't go
you
knocking
out?
on their doors.
And how
They
often-
wouldn't answer if I did anyway.
Oh, okay.
They have to come knocking on your door for you to get on shows like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you go knocking on their doors, they just, they don't open it. Yeah.
Is that because you want to get on those shows?
I mean, if you want to get on 60 Minutes, I can do what I can to help you.
I think he wants to know because he'd like to know when the next time you might be on. He'd like to watch.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that might be the
I don't
question.
know. I don't get those calls very much anymore.
Yeah, you got to be a good
Some of the
person to-
horizontal consequences I was talking about. 60 Minutes,
Yeah,
that's in the past.
That's right. All right, somebody else? Question? All right.
Have you felt that those friends that propped you up, we were kind of talking about it here at our table, who were there for you after everyone left you, felt from them the presence of God and Jesus at that particular time in your life, so that at this point you were able to come here and tell us your story? And if it wasn't for those two people or that were available to you, how do you feel about that?
Yes. I feel very strongly that if it were not for some of the specific people that God brought into my life at a very specific period of time to say some very specific things, I would not be here today. And I include my current wife, Stacy, in that list. She came into my life soon after everything blew up. She was not the cause of the dissolution of my first marriage. And she had been through some similar things years before and had come out on the other side. And so she was a wise and steady guide for me. I tell people all the time that she is living proof to me that God gives us his best when we are at our worst. And between her and Paul Zoll, who I mentioned, and a counselor and a pastor, close pastor friend of ours, and just a handful of other people, they were absolutely instrumental in not only telling me the truth when I needed to hear it, even if it was uncomfortable, giving me hope when I desperately needed hope, giving me perspective when I needed perspective. So, yeah, and I don't want to, let me also add, even though they were not ministering to me in the same capacity that these other people were, my three kids, Gabe, Nate, and Jenna. Gabe is 24, married with 2 kids. Nate is 22, and Jenna just turned 18. Their love for me, unconditional forgiveness of me. I mean, I've always been super close to my kids from the moment they came in this world. I told someone the other day, at different times in my life, I've struggled to be a son, I've struggled to be a brother, I've struggled to be a friend, I've struggled to be a husband. I've never struggled being a dad. I mean, you go through struggles as a dad, but I've never struggled being a dad. I mean, that comes as natural to me as anything. And so we've always been really close. And my biggest pain to this day is the pain that, for me, is the pain that I caused them. And for them to respond to me, and their mother, for that matter, the way they have is just remarkable. So they also have been a real source of healing. Let me say this, too. I didn't say this in either session, but grace is God's instrument for change. And that sounds pretty basic, but we rarely actually believe that. We think that in order for someone to change, remember I said earlier God's two words, law and gospel. We think that in order for someone to change, what they ultimately need is more law. That's not true at all. And all of our lives can testify to that. Those moments in all of our lives where we have been touched and changed the most have been those moments when we have deserved judgment and been given mercy. Every single time. I can look back over the course of my 47 years now and go, those moments in my life that were catalytic to real change were always moments when I deserved punishment or deserved judgment, and in return got love instead. So it's not that we don't need both law and gospel. Like I said, the law does expose us. Martin Luther said the law is for the hard-hearted and the gospel is for the brokenhearted. But if real change is going to happen, it will ultimately happen because someone has felt loved in their weakness. I think it was Walker Percy, a Southern novelist, who said, "We love those who know the worst things about us and don't turn their faces away." And that's true. And that's personified perfectly in Jesus.
Hey, Tullian. My first question, to follow up my second question, is
All right.
do you know about preachers and sneakers?
Yeah, I heard about that. It was an Instagram account, wasn't it?
It's an Instagram account.
So is it still going on?
Yes, just for quick clarification, because this leads into my second question. Preachers and Sneakers is an account that a lot of one guy started, and he saw a bunch of pastors wearing, very expensive clothes, very expensive sneakers.
Yeah.
And people started freaking out about it, yelling at pastors, all this type of stuff.
Yeah.
My question for you is, I wanted to know your perspective about, because of your past, being in the spotlight, being, very well known, coming down from all of that and coming into a place of, I'm assuming, humility and seeing.
Yes, I'm extremely humble now.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm very proud of it.
Right.
I'm just
Naturally. I'd just like to know your perspective, seeing because of where you've come from.
Yeah.
And your perspective really on the whole thing, mega churches.
Yeah.
Famous pastors.
Yeah.
A lot of people are very turned off by
Yeah.
mega churches, turned off by Christianity because they see pastors with Kanye West and all this type of stuff, and it's like people get very turned off seeing pastors like that. What
Yeah.
would you what's your perspective on that culture?
Yeah. Well, I can answer that, I think, by giving a broad analysis on the church as a whole. So you have a variety of different flavors inside the church, specifically in America. Someone pointed out that, I'm sort of a jeans, boots, and t-shirt guy. So that's my fashion. But someone pointed out on that Instagram page, that there are these sort of mega church pastors, I'm assuming, who are, wearing like, $2,000 pairs of sneakers. I didn't even know they made sneakers for $2,000, to be honest with you, but $2,000 pair of sneakers, and it's very flashy and all that stuff. And some of the people who are coming down on them, which, mind you, I think all of that is fairly silly, okay? But then the irony was that there were some people on the much more high church traditional side of things that were pointing out just how silly that was. And then someone pointed out about them that the very robes and clerical garb that they wear on Sunday morning cost thousands and thousands of dollars, okay? So, I think we are... Here's what I've learned, And it has more to do with me than it does just a sort of a generalized analysis of the church as a whole, which I think has massive problems. And to be honest with you, I think, like I said in my last session, the primary problem with the church is not its methods, good or bad, it's its message, and it's all primarily in one way, shape, or form a message of do more, try harder, get better. Okay? That's a problem. That sort of moralistic, do more, try harder, get better, what Martin Luther called a theology of glory, not God's glory, but our glory, a ladder climbing version of the Christian faith, that has created a culture which is a ladder climbing, performancism kind of culture. And that manifests itself in a variety of different ways. It might manifest itself by, choosing to flash your $1,000 sneakers. It might manifest itself in being the person who judges those whatever the case may be. My thing has been when my sin bothers me more than other people's sin, I'm moving towards spiritual health. And I think my friend and mentor Paul Zoll has said this, but I think probably one of the most ignored, overlooked verses in the Bible is, why do you pick out the speck in your brother's eye and ignore the plank in your own? And I see that going on everywhere. I mean, I'm kind of doing it right now, as a matter of fact. I'm kind of pointing out the speck of the people who point out specks. It's almost inescapable, okay? I mean, self-righteousness is almost inescapable, which is why we need Jesus' righteousness. But, I mean, I think the messaging of the church is its primary problem. We don't preach, it is finished. We preach, just do it. And there are a variety of just do it flavors. There's the just do it health, wealth, prosperity version. Just do it so you can get good things here and now. There's the just do it theological version. If you don't do A, B, and C, God will, you may not be a Christian. Do more, try harder for yourself is the health, wealth, prosperity stuff. Do more, try harder for God is more the evangelical kind of play. But it's still do more, try harder. So until the church starts unabashedly preaching an unadulterated, it is finished message with no strings attached, and a culture is birthed out of that message, we're going to continue seeing stuff like this nonstop. I told someone on a podcast the other day, I was just ranting a little bit, which I do from time to time, but I just said the whole thing needs to burn, man. I mean, look, at some point, and I was a deep insider for a long time, and then I was an outsider for the last 4 years. So I have this unique perspective of not only being born into it, but then sort of rising through the ranks in my own right, and then crashing, burning, and being on the curb. And so I have this sort of perspective on all of it, and my takeaway is I don't trust any of it. I just don't, because it's coming from a bad foundation. It just is. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, but Martin Luther distinguished between what he called a theology of glory and a theology of the cross. A theology of glory is all about us. The focus of the Christian faith is the life of the Christian, rather than the focus of the Christian faith being the finished work of Jesus. So in a theology of glory, like I said, our glory, not God's, the goal is transformation. We're obsessed with transformation. Transform this, transform that. We're preaching sermons all with the intended goal of transforming. Transformation has become the root of our message. The problem is when transformation becomes the root of our message, real transformation is never the fruit. When substitution is the root of our message, That it's not about, Christianity is not about living for God. The focus and foundation of Christianity is the fact that God in Christ lived for me. The substitutionary work of Jesus for us, standing in our, earning the righteousness we could not gain, and dying the death of condemnation that we should have died, and taking that righteousness that is required before God and giving it to us for free, so that before God now we are perfect, clothed in an irremovable suit of forgiveness and righteousness. Until that becomes the focus, real transformation will never happen. So the way I put it is, when substitution is the focus, transformation is the fruit. When transformation is the focus, transformation never happens. And I think if we were, this is another rant, but I just think that if you really listen, and I mean really listen to preaching these days, it is 99.999% transformation rather than substitution. And that's one of the reasons why we have some of the issues we have, institutionally and otherwise, in my opinion.
All right, someone else? Okay.
So one thing that we were discussing here at our table that you had said in the first session was about that we should have the realization that in the future, even as Christians, that things can get worse, or we can. That's a bad paraphrase.
Your greatest failure may be in front of you.
Exactly, that the greatest failure may be in front of you. And I think for some people that have been through a lot, that's a scary realization to come to, especially when Scripture tells us all through that we weren't given the spirit of fear and to walk boldly and courageous. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and kind of encourage us how to maybe humble ourselves and I guess come to a place of, what did we say, Scott, like a humility and realization.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, the idea that our greatest failure may be in front of us invokes some fear and trepidation, obviously, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I should be somewhat fearful that I'm going to hurt my kids, or I'm going to make a decision that's going to really hurt someone that I love. The freedom comes from knowing and believing that even if I do fail, and even if I do hurt the ones that I love, that does not change the way God feels about me. That's where the freedom comes. So I'm always talking, I don't necessarily say this explicitly, but I'm always talking on two planes, the horizontal plane and the vertical. And we often confuse these two things. Okay, so for instance, my illustration about if I pray and read my Bible and do all the things, journal and all those things, that, God will love me more. And if I don't do those things or slacken those things, God will love me less. That's confusing the vertical and horizontal. Because of what Jesus has done, the sweatshop is closed. It is finished. Everything between God and me is forever and finally settled because of Jesus. Now, I go on and live my life, and I make bad choices, I make good choices, I love those around me, I hurt those around me, I suffer the consequences of every choice that I make, both good and bad. And that becomes the flavor of my life. There are ups, there are downs, there are good times, there are bad times, there are times of great joy and times of great mourning and all of that stuff. But what anchors me in and through the storms of life is the sure and certain vertical foundation that I'm in forever. That while this is kind of always shaky, this never wavers. So I would say, yes, it's a little scary to think that my greatest failure could be in front of me. At the same time, that may curtail, some bad choices. Someone asked me in another question and answer session about a year ago, maybe it was a little bit longer than that. They said, if everything you're saying about God and the way he loves us is true, if everything you're saying about the gospel is true, then why shouldn't I go out and have an affair? And I looked at him and said, because you'll screw up your life, dude. It has nothing to do with God. That's done, dude. Yeah, that's done. Like, Jesus made sure it is finished. We don't sin or not sin because it somehow affects the way God feels about us. We sin or not sin because of the way it affects us and other people around us. So I'm like, if you're genuinely a Christian and you have an affair, that doesn't change the fact that you're in forever with God, but you might lose your spouse, hurt your kids, lose opportunity. I mean, don't do it because it's stupid. Like, that's why. We don't need to spiritualize it. Like, don't do it because it's dumb. It'll hurt you. It'll hurt those who love you. It'll hurt those that you love, and blah, blah. That's what I mean by constantly keeping the vertical and horizontal on their proper spheres, if that makes sense.
All right, somebody else. Okay.
There's a movement, a project out there right now, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It's called the 22 a day.
What's it called?
22 a day.
Okay.
It's something that
Does that have something to do with burpees and pull-ups? Oh, okay. Because I do some of those.
It's something that's I hold very near and dear to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's 22 a day is 22 veterans take their life each day. And more often than not, they have so much profound and traumatic guilt. I'm curious to know, how would you counsel someone like that who has a belief, a deep-seated belief that they don't deserve forgiveness, so much so that they do end up ending their own life?
Yeah.
Someone who believes, not just feels, but believes that they are so far beyond redemption that the only out is to leave.
I'm not familiar with that movement, and I don't have a ton of acquaintances or friends who feel that way for that reason. Veterans. But I know lots of other people who contemplate taking their own life on a daily basis because of the level of guilt and shame they feel for something they've done or failed to do. I can state a couple of facts. Number one, the only answer to that, ultimately speaking, is the gospel. Because the gospel is the sure and certain promiscuous distribution of God's unconditional love and forgiveness. That is the only ultimate answer to hopelessness. Now, you and I may know that, but when you're sitting across the table from someone who's living in such a fog that they can't see the first glimmer of light no matter how brightly you're shining it in their face, it requires an absolute work of God. I mean, one of the things that I take into counseling sessions or any sort of counseling that I may do is to remember Job's friends in a couple of ways. If you remember the story, Job loses everything, he crashes and burns, all that stuff. 3 of his friends who live far away hear about his suffering, so they decide to take a journey to go visit him and comfort him. And when they were, 100 feet away, they could see Job, and they saw how disheveled he was, and they were blown away. He was emaciated, and his clothes were ripped and body filled with sores, and, didn't look anything like the friend that they had known for so many years. And the Bible says that they sat on the ground with him they tore their clothes, sat on the ground with him for 7 days, and didn't say a word. And I often say that Job's friends were amazing counselors until they opened their mouth. Because when they finally did open their mouth, this is essentially what they said for 30 some odd chapters. This is how the world works, Job. Good people get good stuff, bad people get bad stuff. You're clearly getting bad stuff. What did you do wrong? So that's one thing. The other thing is that God, and it's connected to that, God has given us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we'll listen twice as much as we talk. I think Christians talk more than they listen, and it should be the exact opposite. Whether it's someone who's dealing with that or someone who's dealing with hopelessness for another reason, I think we underestimate the power of presence and listening. I think we feel obligated when someone comes to us in pain and in a fog of hopelessness. We feel an internal obligation to rescue them out. And we typically do that by giving advice, oftentimes unsolicited advice. And I think, number one, when we realize God is the only one who can get them out of this fog, ultimately. He may use me to help them, but ultimately, if this person's going to get out of this fog, it's going to be God who does it. And maybe what God wants me to do is just listen and be present. When I was at my worst, there would be people who would text me, for instance, just thinking about you. If you ever need anything, let me know. And at times, I would be in such a deep funk or a deep fog, I wouldn't even respond. Not because I wasn't grateful for it. I just didn't feel like interacting at all. And, you fast forward a few years, I look back now and realize that just knowing they were there helped sustain me. Just knowing. Even if I didn't respond or reach out, the people who I knew were there made it clear they were. Don't underestimate the power of presence. Sending a text. If you send a text, I have a friend of mine who's a dad. His kids haven't spoken to him in years, and he just stopped trying. I said, don't every night before you go to bed, text every single one of them and tell them you love them, you miss them, and you hope they sleep well. Every night. And if they never respond, they never respond. That's between them and God. But you just be present. So, the gospel answers the guilt question. Jesus took all of our guilt, nailed it to a tree. We are no longer condemned. There's nothing we can do or fail to do to get God to stop loving us because that was secured forever in Jesus. That's the ultimate answer to the question. But when people are in a funk like the kind you're talking about, it's really hard for them to hear that. And when they are incapable of hearing, that does not mean they are incapable of sensing your presence.
Kind of a broad question, but other than the messages that you preach, how would you describe the difference in the church you led 10 years ago and the church you lead today?
Well, for one, it's got a lot less money and a lot smaller. That's the first big difference. There are a lot of differences. Like, and I'm joking, but it's small. We just started. We launched 2 weeks ago. We started meeting together back in May weekly, about 100 folks or so, maybe a little bit more. But we officially launched 2 weeks ago. And so we are right at the infant stage. So there are a lot of differences. I came from a very large, well-established, famous church to a startup. So there are a lot of differences, but I think the biggest difference has nothing to do with the 2 churches. It has to do with the 2 pastors, meaning me 10 years ago and me today. I was telling Scott and the guys at the table a few minutes ago. I don't care if this church has 100 people or 1,000 people. I honestly don't care. And that is so liberating to me. I am so grateful to be alive. I mean, I'm not kidding. The greatest emotion that I feel on a day-to-day basis these days is gratitude, overwhelmingly so. I mean, I'm not supposed to be here. This church is not supposed to be here. And yet I am, and it is. And the only thing I can say to that is, but God. I mean, I'm just so grateful for the smallest things. My wife and I live in this little 2-bedroom villa in Jupiter, Florida. I mean, it's a rental. That's the smallest place I've lived in 20 years. It's it's near the beach. We can walk to the beach from where we are, but I mean, it's a small little rental place. I wake up every morning and I'm like, I've got a roof over my head. And I live in South Florida, which is my home, and I love it. And I live near the beach, and God's given me this small group of people to love and to lead. And He's given me a supportive wife who just so enjoys doing ministry by my side. And, I don't have money anymore, but our bills are paid every month. And I'm just grateful. Like literally, I mean, I was hopeless 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I mean, hopeless. Dead in the water. Death is preferable to life. I will never be happy again. I'm consigned to live the rest of my life in just depression. And I just wake up every morning now and go, man. So I look at people different. When I'm standing up there preaching on Sundays now, I look at them different. I see them differently. I have more empathy for them. There's a slight difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is me saying I'm really sorry for what you're going through. Empathy is me feeling what you're going through because I've been through it myself. And so even though there is a segment of Christianity that can't stand the fact that I'm pastoring again because I have forever disqualified myself because of my past sin, the truth of the matter is I'm probably more pastoral now than I ever was before. I actually love people more now than I did before. And so that's probably the biggest difference. So I'm just a different guy. I am. And that will hopefully in turn create a different church. It's not like I was a total jerk before. I mean, I wasn't. Some people might say I was, but I don't think I was. It wasn't that. It's just, success has a way of going to your head, and everybody handles that differently. So.
Basically, his question and marrying part of what you said, and I'm sure there's individual examples of both embrace and rejection from your former congregation and then moving back home close by to the former congregation. Yeah. But is there a general sense of how the former congregation handled it then and now about, as a general sense, embrace or rejection of having you back in the ministry close by?
Yeah. Well, that is a temptation. Let me say this. We're far enough away. We're 55 miles north, so it's not like, and South Florida is a big place, so it's not like there's 3 churches and we're one of them. Different county, different area, different demographic. So even though it's geographically somewhat close, culturally and all that, it's very different. So our worlds do not intersect at all. It's not like people from their church are going to leave and come to ours, or, that's not going to happen. So it's not an immediate threat. I don't know. I mean, one of the best ways for, one of the best ways for churches and former pastors of those churches to heal is to just go your separate ways. And reconciliation can happen, and in many individual cases, reconciliation does happen. Any sort of manufactured or forced reconciliation always backfires. So I've never asked anything from them. I will say this. I'm not the only one who sinned in the equation in 2015. I wasn't the only sinner involved in everything falling apart, both at home and the church. But at the same time, I have made a vow to confess my own sin and no one else's. For the first year, I was confessing everyone else's sin and not my own, and that led to slavery for me. And so I think the whole situation could have been handled better by the church in 2015? Absolutely. Churches historically and typically do not handle situations like that well at all. At all. And we talked to hundreds of former pastors who have experienced similar things. It's just, they pour their life into a place. A lot of them are afraid to even share that they're struggling because they're afraid they'll lose their job. I mean, literally, the idea that a pastor is supposed to have his life in perfect order, and so that he feels threatened if it's not. And I can't really open up and tell my board about this or the leaders about this because I've got kids in school and I got bills to pay and I got, there's a real fear there. And so they have to sort of clam up. And then if something does blow up, it is out the door. I'm talking guys who I know have served church for 25 years and get a 3-month severance kind of stuff. That's just, you typically wouldn't get that in a company. And plus with a pastor too, you don't just lose your whole life. Your social life is the church. Your friends are the church. Your staff becomes your best friends. The people in your church become your family friends. So it's your job. If you're a doctor and you go through something like what I went through, your family might fall apart, but you still got your job, your livelihood's still there. With a pastor, it's not that way. They really lose it all. So, yeah, could the church have handled it very differently? Absolutely. Could I have handled it differently? Absolutely. Everybody could have handled it differently. And I think we've sort of, I have a handful of really good relationships with people inside that church, some of the leaders of that church and some of the people on staff at that church. But in terms of any kind of formal it's a different place now. The leadership's different. The staff, in many cases, is different. The demographic's different. It's a different place. So I would probably stand up there now in front of that church, and 80% of the people who would be there now would be like, who's this guy? They would know who I am, but they wouldn't know who I am because I was their pastor. So there was a lot of turnover at that point. That's kind of vague, I know, but I'm intentionally being vague because I could sin greatly if I wasn't vague. I don't want to do that.
Would you say that your theology about love and grace and suffering changed as a result of what you went through, your experiences, or just your understanding of those things?
It did not change. I think that's the reason I'm alive today. I was telling my mom the other day on the phone, people who have felt burdened by the church, abandoned by the church, broken by the church. I talk to a lot of these people, and they, some of them ex-pastors, and they've just kind of abandoned the faith altogether. And I'm like, why has that not happened to me? And I think the reason is because this message that I have been giving to you guys today is exactly what I've believed for years and years and years. The theological paradigm for me has not shifted. It's only deepened and proven itself to be even more true than I understood it to be before. So I sinned in the way that I did, not because I believed the gospel too much, but because I believed it too little in a moment when I needed to believe it more. So grace is not the culprit for my fall. I am. And I remember when it all happened and people said, well, this is what you get when you preach grace the way that guy does. You just live like a hellion, you know? And I'm like, no, don't blame grace for my sin. I fell in the way that I did not because I believed the message I was preaching too much, but because I believed it too little in moments when I needed to believe it more. So it has only deepened and solidified. I believe it. I believed it with all of my heart then, but my heart's been expanded, so I believe it with even more of my heart now.
All right, a couple more questions.
Do you believe or do you know whether your grandfather had any influence on Donald Trump?
No. Oh, well, you'd have to ask Donald Trump that. I don't know. I know that I met President Trump twice, and both times were in situations celebrating my granddad. His 95th birthday party. That was before he was president, and then my granddad's funeral. It's only 2 times I've met him. And we deeply appreciated the fact that he was there at both of those occasions. But in terms of any kind of, influence, by the time, I don't know if they had met before that, before the 95th birthday. They may have, but if they did, I don't know about it. And, my granddad for the last 10, 12 years of his life was basically house-ridden. He was just so old, and so he wasn't having much of an influence on anybody at that time. But if they met before that for whatever reason, and whatever, is it possible that my granddad's life and very public ministry impacted Donald Trump when he was younger? Possibly, but I don't know.
All right, someone else?
I want to say that I really do appreciate your transparency and your open-heartedness, and it's like you said, sharing your weaknesses and your story helps more than sharing the successes. You probably have answered this already in a broadest sense of your messages and what you've said, and with Jason asking the question if your belief or your theology, did it change because of your experience, or was it already there? And I like the way you had said that you needed to believe. It didn't change. It became a revelation more because of what had happened. Is any practical accountability, you would say, in place so that would not that you would ever be tempted again with a similar situation? I really think that because of your humbleness, God will use that, and your scope and sphere of influence will broaden. And I believe that I can appreciate you saying if it's 100 people or 1,000 people, it doesn't matter to you.
No.
I pastored for over 25 years, and now I'm a hospice chaplain, and I go in the nursing homes, and when I speak, that's just as much a joy to me than it is when Scott asked me to preach to, several hundred people that are here. So the question is there anything, an accountability that you feel like now in place, or is it strictly just I have the revelation now that I would never find myself in that place again to make those decisions that I should not have made?
Yeah, I first of all, I think that adultery was the one thing I was certain I would never do. And I had all sorts of safeguards in place. And I would impose those safeguards on my staff. I was very strict about little things like you're not in a room by yourself with a person of the opposite sex who isn't your spouse. You're not in a car. You don't have lunch meetings. I mean, I was really strict about all that stuff because I felt a really strong conviction about that. That was always modeled in my home growing up, and my granddad, of course, was famous for that. And so that was a big deal to me. Yeah.
George Beverly Shea.
Yeah.
That your grandfather Billy Graham was preaching in another country, and they were always trying to find out whether they did anything wrong. Of course, I know his accountability was his George Beverly Shea to go and check the room before he would walk in and see if he wasn't set up.
Yeah, that's right.
So they had posted on the news the next day, and the headlines was that Billy Graham spent the night with George Beverly Shea. So
right, yeah. And it's or with Beverly Shea.
Beverly Shea.
Yeah,
they
right.
left out George.
Yeah,
So
of
he
course.
spent the night with Beverly Shea.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I was certain that's not the way that I would fall. And I did. I never want to be so certain that I can't fall in a certain way again. So that's the first thing, to begin to recognize that.
Is that kind of the realization that fall could come?
Yeah, certainly. No, it can. And I just think, well, of course I could do the same thing again. I'm a sinner, for God's sakes. I mean, I could do it, and any one of us could do it. I've learned a couple things in the last few years. Number one, you are capable of failing in a way that seems unimaginable to you right now. All of us are. Number two, if and when you do fail in some unimaginable way, God will not bail on you. Those two things I've learned so I know that all of us are capable of falling and failing in a way that seems unimaginable to us right now. So I never want to be in a place where I think, well, I would never do that. I could. Two, while accountability is important, I had everything set up as well as I could, and the sinful heart goes in directions that knows how to meander through accountability structures. And that's not to say that accountability is unimportant or that it's unnecessary. It's that it's not a sure thing. Three, there are, I think, three great accountability partners that I have right now. One, the pain of failing. My greatest accountability partner right now is my deep desire to never hurt anyone I love the way that I hurt them before. Number two is my wife. She never asked for this, but soon after we first met, she did something that kind of changed the way I think about visibility between husbands and wives. She knew that I was struggling with trust. She knew that I was struggling. My first marriage ended because both my now ex-wife and I were both unfaithful at the end of our marriage. So not only was I dealing with the guilt and shame of doing it, I was dealing with the sense of betrayal of it having been done to me. So I was having a really difficult time trusting anybody. Friends were leaving. I was scared of people. And when Stacy met me, maybe 3 or 4 months after she met me, and she could really sense this struggle because I was having a hard time trusting her. I didn't know her. She asked for my phone, and she put all of her stuff on my phone. Her emails. Now when she gets an email, it goes to her phone and my phone. Her social media, her Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, everything. I didn't ask her to do that. She just did it. And the reason she did that was so that I would encounter someone who was trustworthy, that I had she was not afraid to open everything up to me and say, I'll be an open book with you. I didn't do it. I didn't reciprocate right away because there were things I didn't want her to see. I mean, we weren't married yet, and we were just started dating, and I loved her, but I was still trying to, maybe get back with my ex-wife and vacillating between the two, and there were just things I wasn't ready to be that visible with her yet. But over time, I did, and as a result, we both see everything from each other, which is really freeing, actually. And it does curtail certain things, I mean, if there's a instant message so if any of you guys message me instantly on any social media, just know my wife's going to see it too, okay? So don't confess some egregious sin, or if you do, just make sure you block your name out or something. Or just say, hey, Tullian, and then parentheses, and Stacy. I mean, we don't like check each other's stuff all the time. So it's not like you guys can send me messages and she's not going to read it, okay? Or if you have sent me a message, don't be like, holy crap, I shouldn't have said that. Now his wife, don't worry about that. She probably hasn't seen it. But the fact of the matter is, it is actually very freeing to have complete visibility. Her contacts are on my phone. My contacts are on her phone. Her emails go to her phone and my phone. My emails go to my phone and her phone. All the social media. I mean, there is something that's new for me. My ex-wife and I, it wasn't like we were purposefully hiding things from each other. We didn't even think about that stuff. But that's kind of the way Stacy and I roll. And it's really, really helpful. So between my wife, God ultimately, and not wanting, that's a heart steered in the right direction is the best accountability. Because the best accountability structures will do nothing for a heart that's determined to go in the wrong direction. I forget who said it. Maybe it was Thomas Chalmers who said, what the heart wants, the mind justifies, and the will goes after. And so it doesn't matter what you put in place. And that's not to say if you have a particular struggle with something, there are some external safeguards that can and should be put in place that can curtail or at least minimize some of the temptation to go indulge in whatever that may be. But at the end of the day, those things won't save us.
All right, it is 2:00. I think he has poured out a whole lot of information today. And I know that you guys have learned and have enjoyed this. So will you please give Tullian a huge hand?
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Yeah.